In the autumn of 1992, a construction crew widening a freeway south of San Diego drove their machines into the earth and struck something they were never supposed to find. It didn't look like much: a scatter of broken bone in the dirt, a few gray stones that seemed out of place in the soft sand, the kind of thing a bulldozer operator pushes aside and forgets about by lunch. But one man on that site stopped the machines, and what his team pulled out of the ground over the next 5 months didn't just add a page to the story of America, it detonated the entire book. Because when the bones were finally tested not with guesswork, but with radioactive elements that decay at a fixed, measurable rate, the number that came back wasn't 13,000 years. It wasn't 20,000. It was 130,000 years old. A date so impossible that if it is right, then everything you were ever taught about who reached this continent first and when is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Wrong by more than 100,000 years. Wrong by so much that it would place someone butchering an animal on a California hillside tens of thousands of years before our own species is even thought to have walked out of Africa. This is the story of that excavation, but it is also the story of what it unlocked, because that single freeway dig cracked open a door that scientists had nailed shut for 100 years, and once it was open, other discoveries came pouring through it. Discoveries that had been sitting in storage boxes in museum basements, dismissed, ignored, and laughed out of the room for decades. A frozen cave in the Yukon where a man was mocked for most of his career before the bones finally proved him right. A mountaintop in Mexico packed with stone tools that, by every rule of the textbook, should not exist. A riverbank in South Carolina with a date so old the laboratory equipment could barely measure it. A desert in California that quietly destroyed the reputation of one of the most celebrated scientists who ever lived. And a site so extreme that the geologist who dated it says defending the numbers ended her career. Every one of them was called a mistake. Every one of them ran into the same brutal, unforgiving wall of doubt. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why, and you are going to see the single discovery that finally silenced the skeptics for good. Because while the archaeologists spent decades arguing over broken rocks, the ground itself was keeping a secret. And in a dried lake bed in New Mexico, it left behind the one thing that cannot be faked, cannot be explained away, and cannot be ignored. It changed human history. And it started with a highway in San Diego. To understand why a scatter of broken bone could shake an entire field to its foundations, you first have to understand the rule it broke. For most of the last century, the story of the first Americans was clean, tidy, and almost universally accepted. The first people crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska near the end of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago. They carried a distinctive stone spear point, first identified near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, and so they were given a name, the Clovis people. They were the first. That was not a theory. That was the law. And it was enforced like one. To stand up in front of other archaeologists and suggest that anyone had arrived before the Clovis people was, in the words of one scientist, tantamount to announcing you had just seen Elvis walk out of a Burger King. Careers were built on the rule. Careers were also ended by challenging it. For 50 years, if your evidence pointed to something older than Clovis, the safest thing you could do for your reputation was to keep your mouth shut and dig somewhere else. That is the wall the San Diego freeway ran straight into. In November of 1992, the state of California was expanding State Route 54 in San Diego County. A paleontologist named Richard Cerutti was on site, monitoring the earth moving, watching for fossils, when the machinery exposed a patch of broken bone. The site would eventually carry his name, the Cerutti Mastodon site. Over the next 5 months, a team from the San Diego Natural History Museum, led by paleontologist Tom Demere, painstakingly excavated the remains of a single American mastodon, a heavy-limbed relative of the elephant that once roamed the continent. But this was no ordinary bone bed, and the deeper they dug, the stranger it got. The mastodon's bones had been broken in a very particular way. Its heavy limb bones were shattered while they were still fresh, snapped with the kind of spiral fractures you only get when a heavy stone strikes living bone. The same technique ancient people used the world over to get at the rich marrow inside. 2 of its massive femur heads, the rounded ball ends of the thigh bones, had been laid side by side. one facing up, one facing down, not scattered, placed, and among the fine sand around them sat 5 large stones, stones that had no business being in that soft sediment, stones that showed wear and impact marks, as if they had been used as hammers and anvils to crack those bones open. To the team, it did not look like an accident. It looked like a butchering site. It looked like someone, or something, had knelt in that dirt and processed this animal with deliberate skill. And then came the number that changed everything. When geologists tested the bones using uranium and thorium elements that decay at a known, steady, unforgiving rate, they were not expecting a surprise. They were expecting the usual. Instead, the result came back at roughly 130,000 years. Sit with that for a second. 100,000 years before the Clovis people. Tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens is thought to have left Africa. If humans in the ordinary sense weren't even on this side of the planet yet, then who knelt in the San Diego dirt and broke open that mastodon? The team knew exactly how explosive that question was, and they were careful with it. When they published their findings in the journal Nature in 2017, they did not claim these were modern humans. They couldn't. Instead, they wrote, with enormous caution, that the site had been created by an unidentified species of Homo, some earlier member of the human family, a cousin we have not yet imagined walking the shores of North America, cracking bones on a hillside 100,000 years too early. The reaction was swift, and it was brutal. There is an old principle in science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And to most archaeologists, a pile of broken bones and a handful of rounded rocks did not come remotely close. Critics pointed to something uncomfortable. The site had been discovered by heavy construction equipment tearing through the ground. Could the machinery itself have cracked those ancient bones and driven those stones down into the sediment? Others argued that the very fracture patterns the team held up as proof of butchery could be produced by nothing more than natural forces. Other animals or the slow, grinding pressure of 100,000 years of Earth pressing down. Tom Demere never claimed to have all the answers. He admitted, plainly, that one site does not make a new paradigm, but he stood by the evidence. And he asked the scientific community to do the single hardest thing you can ask of it, to keep an open mind, to reconsider a story that had felt settled for generations. To this day, the Cerutti Mastodon remains one of the most controversial claims in American archaeology. Most scientists still don't accept the date. But here is what actually matters. And here is why this freeway dig belongs at the front of this story. It cracked the door open. Because once you allow yourself to ask, even for a moment, whether the timeline might be wrong, you start looking at every other site in a very different light. And some of those sites had been waiting, dismissed, and gathering dust for a very long time. Travel 3,000 miles north of that San Diego freeway into the frozen heart of the Yukon, and you reach a place called the Bluefish Caves. They are not grand. 3 small hollows carved into a limestone ridge, none of them larger than a modest room, looking out over the Bluefish River in the far northwest corner of Canada. This is a region scientists call Beringia. During the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers, the sea level dropped, and Beringia became a vast, cold, grassy land bridge connecting Asia to the Americas. If people walked into the New World, they walked through here. This is the front door of the entire continent. Between 1977 and 1987, an archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated these caves, and what he found astonished him. Among tens of thousands of animal bones, horses, caribou, mammoths, he believed he could see the unmistakable marks of human hands. Cut marks. Butchery. And when he dated some of those bones, the numbers reached back as far as 30,000 years. He said so, publicly. And for that, he was punished. Because in the 1980s, the Clovis first model was iron law. To stand up and claim a site more than twice the age of Clovis, in a place with almost no stone tools and no obvious ancient hearth, was to invite open ridicule. Cinq-Mars watched his life's work get dismissed, year after year. His findings weren't debated so much as brushed aside. His excavation became a cautionary tale that older archaeologists told younger ones. This is what happens when you get carried away. he grew bitter. He became convinced the establishment had refused to even look at his evidence. Not disprove it, just refuse to look. And then, long after almost everyone had stopped paying attention, someone finally looked. A young French archaeologist named Lauriane Bourgeon returned to that old collection of bones, now boxed up and sitting in storage, and examined it with modern eyes and modern instruments. She studied more than 30,000 bone fragments. And on the jawbone of an ancient Yukon horse, she found something that could not be argued away. A series of straight, clean, parallel cuts, in exactly the spot where a stone blade would slice to remove the animal's tongue. Not the ragged puncture of a wolf's tooth, not the random scrape of a trampling hoof. The deliberate, repeated work of a tool held in a human hand. When those bones were radiocarbon dated at a laboratory in Oxford, the results, published in 2017, confirmed the impossible. Humans had been butchering horses in these caves as far back as 24,000 years ago. In a single stroke, Bluefish Caves became the oldest known archaeological site in North America, and quietly vindicated a man who had been mocked for most of his career. Jacques Cinq-Mars died in 2021, still waiting for full acceptance, but the tide had turned. The wall of certainty was cracking. And the next crack was going to come from a cave high in the mountains of Mexico. High in the arid mountains of northern Zacatecas, Mexico, there is a cave so remote and so difficult to reach that almost no one would go there without a very good reason. It is called Chiquihuite. It sits nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, a dark chamber tucked beneath a limestone cliff, and in 2020, it produced a claim that made headlines around the world. An archaeologist named Cyprien Ardelian had been digging inside that cave for years. Deep in its floor, sealed beneath layers of hardened mud and rubble, his team recovered nearly 2,000 pieces of broken limestone. To Ardelian, these were not random rocks. They were tools flakes, blades, points, and cores, shaped by human hands. And the layers holding them were old, very old. When his team published in the journal Nature, the dates were staggering. The oldest layers reached back 31 to 33,000 years. The clearest evidence of people clustered around 26,500 years ago. If Ardelian was right, humans had been sheltering in this high mountain cave more than 10,000 years before Clovis, during the very coldest, harshest depths of the last ice age, when the textbooks insist the Americas were empty. But there was one problem, and it was a serious one. The cave contained no human bones, no human DNA, no hearths that could be firmly tied to people. The entire case rested on the stones themselves, and whether those stones were tools or simply rocks became the heart of a furious argument. Here's where you need to learn a word, because it is going to follow us through every remaining site in this story. That word is geofact. A geofact is a stone that looks like a tool but was never touched by a human. It is broken and flaked by nature alone, by rock falling from a cave ceiling, by stones tumbling down a cliff face, by the slow grinding of debris over thousands of years. Nature, it turns out, is perfectly capable of manufacturing convincing fakes. In 2021, a team of respected archaeologists, led by Jim Chatters and Ben Potter, published a blistering response. They argued that Chiquihuite Cave sat in exactly the kind of place where nature mass-produces those fakes beneath a cliff prone to rockfall, filled with sliding debris. They pointed out that the so-called tools showed no consistent patterned flaking, the signature fingerprint of deliberate human craft, and they raised a deeper objection. If people were truly in this cave 26,000 years ago, it would mean humans were in the Americas before the genetic split that separates Native Americans from their East Asian ancestors even happened. The entire human family tree would have to be redrawn. Ardelian fired back, defending his site fiercely, analyzing his strongest tools one by one, pointing to signs of wear and intentional shaping he insisted could not be explained by any falling rock. To this day, the honest answer is that no one knows for certain. Chiquihuite sits in a kind of scientific limbo, too well documented to ignore, too thin on hard proof to command belief. But the pattern was becoming impossible to miss. Again and again, someone finds broken stone in ancient earth. Again and again, it comes down to the same haunting question. Did a human make this, or did the earth only make it look that way? and nowhere would that question get sharper than on a riverbank in South Carolina. Along the banks of the Savannah River in Allendale County, South Carolina, there is a place where the ground is rich with stone. For thousands of years, ancient people came here to harvest chert, a hard, flint-like rock, perfect for making sharp tools. The site is called Topper, named for the local man who first led archaeologists to it. And the man who would make Topper famous and then infamous was an archaeologist named Albert Goodyear. Here is what makes Goodyear's story different from the others. He was not a rebel. When he began serious excavations in the 1980s, Topper was a good, solid, respectable site. By the late 1990s, his team had documented a clear Clovis presence, making it one of the most important early sites in the American Southeast. And Goodyear himself was a believer in the standard story. He did not expect to find anything older than Clovis. He saw little reason to dig deeper. Then, in 1998, he decided to break the rule anyway. He dug below the Clovis layer, the floor most archaeologists treated as the literal bottom of human history in America. And he did not hit empty, sterile ground. He found stone tools, small scrapers, blades, and flakes, sitting in soil that dated to around 16,000 years, thousands of years before Clovis. That alone was enough to make him a controversial figure overnight. But Goodyear was not finished. In 2004, acting on what he openly called a hunch, he pushed nearly 4 meters deeper into the ancient river terrace. And there, buried in the sand, he found more chipped stone, and beside it, a dark stain in the soil. The carbonized remains of ancient burned plants, possibly a campfire. When that charcoal was sent for radiocarbon dating, 2 results came back that stunned him. Roughly 50,000 years. And one older still past 51,000. 50,000 years, in South Carolina, long before the last ice age even reached its peak. If the stones beside that charcoal were tools, then humans had walked this riverbank an astonishing 37,000 years before Clovis. Goodyear even had a star piece, a large chunk of worked chert he affectionately nicknamed Big Red, which he was convinced showed clear, repeated strikes from a human hand. But this time, the doubt struck at the very method itself. 50,000 years is right at the outer edge of what radiocarbon dating can even measure. Push past that limit and a sample is effectively radiocarbon dead. The reading becomes deeply, dangerously unreliable. Critics argued the dark stain might not be a campfire at all, but the residue of a natural wildfire. And the stones, once again, drew the same one-word verdict from skeptics: geofacts. Natural fractures. One critic pointed out something devastating. The deep tools looked nearly identical across an enormous span of time, unchanged from 50,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago. And that is simply not how real human technology behaves. Real technology evolves, it improves, it changes. These did not. Goodyear held his ground for the rest of his career, and he was not entirely alone. A later study argued that at least some Topper stones showed microscopic traces of genuine use and wear. But the mainstream never accepted the 50,000-year date. Topper became something stranger than proven or disproven. It became a permanent question mark, planted deep in the American earth. And it set the stage for 2 sites so extreme they pushed the whole argument out of the realm of debate and into the realm of the almost unbelievable. To understand this next story, you have to understand the man at the center of it, because he was not a crank. He was one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century. His name was Louis Leakey. Along with his wife Mary, Leakey had transformed our entire understanding of human origins in Africa, unearthing fossils that pushed the human story back millions of years and helped prove that humanity was born on the African continent. When Louis Leakey spoke about ancient humans, the world listened. In 1959, an archaeologist from California named Ruth DeEtte Simpson brought Leakey some curious stones. They came from the Mojave Desert, from a place in the Calico Hills. To Simpson, they looked like scrapers' ancient tools. And Leakey was intrigued, for a reason all his own. He was convinced that the sheer number and variety of native languages across the Americas could not possibly have developed in a mere 12,000 years. It felt too fast. He believed people had been here far, far longer, and that no one had simply dug deep enough to prove it. In 1963, with funding from the National Geographic Society, Leakey launched excavations at what became the Calico Early Man site. It was the only site in the New World he ever worked on, and for the rest of his life, he defended it. His team recovered thousands of broken stones they interpreted as tools. And in 1980, using uranium-thorium dating, geologists put an age on the deposits. Not 200 years, not 20,000, roughly 200,000 years. A number so enormous it would place tool-making humans in California before our own species had fully emerged anywhere on Earth. One researcher connected to the site suggested the stones might even be 500,000 years old. The scientific community recoiled, and the objection by now was painfully familiar. No human remains were ever found at Calico, not a single bone. The respected geologist Vance Haynes visited the site and delivered a devastating verdict: the stones were geofacts, fractured by the violent tumbling of an ancient river and debris flow that had once torn through the Calico Hills. Nature had forged these tools, he argued, not people. And then came the most painful blow of all, from inside Leakey's own family. His wife Mary, a brilliant scientist in her own right, did not share his faith in Calico. She wrote with real anguish that his involvement with the site had cost her some of her academic respect for him. She called the Calico excavations catastrophic to his professional reputation. And yet, Louis Leakey never let go. He kept visiting the site several times a year, defending it, until his death in 1972. So what was Calico? Evidence of a lost human timeline erased from every textbook? Or the great blind spot of a great man who wanted so badly to find deep human roots in America that he saw tools where there were only rocks? To this day, the vast majority of scientists say the stones are natural. But Calico endures as one of archaeology's most haunting stories, a reminder that even genius can fall in love with an idea. And Calico is not even the most extreme claim on this list. That title belongs somewhere else. It belongs in the highlands of central Mexico, in a basin near the city of Puebla, at a site whose dates are so staggering they make everything before them look almost cautious. Its name is Hueyatlaco, and more than 60 years after it was found, it remains perhaps the single most contested archaeological site in all the Americas. The story begins in the early 1960s. A Mexican scholar named Juan Armenta Camacho and a young Harvard-trained archaeologist named Cynthia Irwin Williams began excavating a landscape littered with the fossilized bones of Ice Age giants, mammoths, mastodons, camels, dire wolves, ground sloths. It looked like a kill site, a place where ancient hunters had brought down and butchered enormous prey, and the tools they found were not crude. Among the simpler implements were sophisticated pieces finely flaked, double-edged blades, and elegant projectile points, some made from stone carried in from far away. These were the works of skilled, experienced toolmakers, embedded in the earth right alongside the bones of extinct animals. The trouble, as always, was the age, and here the trouble became overwhelming, because the site had no good carbon to test. So, a young geologist named Virginia Steen McIntyre was brought in, an expert in dating volcanic ash layers. Working with colleagues, she applied not one but several independent methods to the ash and sediment that held the tools. Uranium series dating, fission track dating, and the numbers that came back did not just push the timeline, they demolished it. The dates centered around 260,000 years. One method reached even further, suggesting an age of 370,000 years. These were not numbers anyone was prepared to accept. They would place skilled toolmakers in Mexico hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans are believed to have existed at all on a continent that supposedly had no people until 13,000 years ago. What happened next became a legend in its own right. The lead archaeologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, was horrified by the extreme dates and publicly called them irresponsible. The geologists who produced them refused to back down. And Virginia Steen McIntyre found that defending her own data came at a terrible cost. She has said that speaking up about Hueyatlaco damaged her career, that the results were buried, and that the scientific establishment simply refused to grapple with what the dating showed. To this day, her supporters describe Hueyatlaco as a case of suppression, evidence too dangerous to publish. The skeptics offer a calmer explanation. The dating methods of the 1960s and 70s were young and imperfect. Reworked sediment, in which ancient volcanic material gets mixed with younger layers, can produce wildly inflated ages. There are no confirmed sites anywhere else on Earth's western hemisphere remotely this old, and no fossils of the ancient humans who would have made these tools. The dates, they argue, are not a conspiracy. They are simply wrong. And yet the tools are real. No one disputes that human hands shaped those beautiful blades and points. No one disputes they were found among the bones of Ice Age beasts. The only question, the same question that has followed us through every single site in this story, is when. And Hueyatlaco has never been solved. It sits in the record like a locked door, and no one has ever found the key. So where does all of this leave us? 6 sites: a San Diego freeway, a frozen Yukon cave, a mountaintop in Mexico, a river quarry in South Carolina, a desert in California, a basin full of Ice Age bones. 6 times, someone stood over broken stone in ancient Earth and dared to say the same forbidden sentence. We were here far earlier than you think. And 6 times, the scientific world answered with doubt, with skepticism, and with that one unforgiving word, geofacts. It would be easy at this point to simply walk away, to decide the whole thing is fantasy, that every one of these claims is a mistake, a hoax, or a great man's obsession. And to be fair, some of them probably are. Some of those dates are almost certainly wrong. But that would be exactly the wrong lesson to take from this. Because while the archaeologists spent decades locked in their arguments over rocks, is it a tool? Is it a geofact? Is it 50,000 years? Or 50? The ground itself never stopped talking. And it was about to say something that no critic on Earth could argue away. Not a broken rock that might be natural. Not a bone that might have been cracked by a machine. Not a date sitting at the ragged edge of what a laboratory can measure. Something else. Something that isn't a maybe. In a dried lake bed in White Sands, New Mexico, researchers found footprints. Not tools that might be geofacts. Not charcoal that might be a wildfire. Not a stone somebody wanted to see as a scraper. Human footprints pressed into ancient mud and preserved for hundreds of centuries. The prints of adults and children walking along the shoreline of a long vanished lake. In one breathtaking sequence, a single person can be tracked across the flats, following the trail of a giant ground sloth. And this is the detail that ends the entire debate. You cannot argue that a footprint is a geofact. Nature does not accidentally flake a footprint out of a falling rock. A footprint is not ambiguous. A footprint is not a rock that looks like something. A footprint is a person, a moment, a living human being who set their weight down into wet ground and lifted it again and kept walking 20-odd thousand years ago, exactly where the textbooks swore no one could possibly be. The scientists knew that a claim this size would be attacked, so they did something the other sites never could. They dated it, and then they dated it again, and again, using completely different methods that don't depend on each other. First by the seeds of an aquatic plant found in the layers. Then, when critics questioned those seeds, by pollen. Then by grains of quartz, using a technique that measures the last time a mineral saw sunlight. And finally by ancient mud, tested in 2 separate, independent laboratories. Every single method agreed. The footprints were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Clovis people. Laid down during the frozen peak of the last ice age, the exact window the textbooks insisted the Americas were empty, lifeless, untouched by a single human foot. The ground had simply been holding the proof the entire time, waiting for someone to look down instead of up. And that is the quiet triumph buried inside all of this controversy. The wild claims from San Diego, from the Yukon, from Mexico, from that riverbank in South Carolina may never all be proven. Some of them are probably wrong, but taken together, they did something no single discovery could have done on its own. They forced open a door that had been nailed shut for a century. They made room. They made the establishment ask the one question it had refused to ask for 50 years. What if the timeline is wrong? And when White Sands finally answered, the proof walked straight through the door those contested sites had pried open. That freeway crew in San Diego, back in 1992, thought they were just widening a road. They had no idea they were about to strike the first blow against a story that had stood unquestioned for 100 years. They didn't rewrite human history that afternoon, but they cracked it. And every crack that followed, every mocked archaeologist, every impossible date, every stone somebody was brave enough to call a tool, widened the split, until the truth was too big to hold back. The first Americans were here far, far longer than we were ever taught. And they were here during an ice age we were told they could not survive. That is the real gift of these strange, disputed, ridiculed sites. They remind us that the human story is not finished. That certainty is very often just a question no one has thought to ask yet. Somewhere out there under a highway, beneath a riverbank, sealed in the floor of a cave, pressed into the mud of a lake that dried up before recorded history began, the next footprint is already waiting. And the people who left it are still calling to us, across the deep silence of time, asking only one thing: to be remembered. And it started with a highway in San Diego.